are going to go with our next panel. And again, unfortunately, Norma is not going to be with us. She had to leave unexpectedly because of a medical emergency. So again, our prayers are with her as she goes back home. And we have with us Trina Delamere. Oh, I got it, yes. We got to hang out a little bit yesterday. And Harriet, who we've gotten to hang out quite a bit too. I really like these ladies. Who's an emerita professor at McGill University, and she's the founding director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Environment. And Trina is the associate professor of School of Human Nutrition and associate director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Environment. So welcome them.
Good morning, everybody. Segun Zewagwego. Good greetings. Wasundio Yujots. My name is Wasundio. Wagatayuni ni Wagita Rodo. I'm from the Wolf Clan, from the Ganyokahaga Mohawk people, and Gahnawage ni Dewagenu. I'm from Gahnawage community near Montreal in Quebec in Canada. Harriet and I are going to be presenting because, as you heard, Norma had to leave to go home for medical reasons yesterday. Oops, let's get my notes here. I did get to speak with Norma yesterday morning before she left, and she had a few messages that I wanted to share with you. She wanted everyone to know that she thought this was an absolutely amazing conference, and that she's honored to have made so many friends and colleagues, and that she's also honored to work with Harriet and I. And she believes that CINE will continue to be viable for Indigenous peoples, traditional food systems, diet, and health. And she also wanted to leave the message, I think because she was really sad she wasn't going to be able to participate on the elders panel, that we really need to encourage young people to use research with two-eyed seeing. So that's the idea that we bring together Western ways of doing science with Indigenous ways of doing science and valuing them equally as we address the issues that face us for the future. Just an overview of how we're going to proceed with the presentation. Harriet and I will cover Norma's points, basically about the contaminant concerns that brought about the CINE Research Center. And then Harriet will go into some details about the stories of the research that was done through CINE. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the present context of how we're doing academic research community partnerships. So in the mid-'80s and early '90s in Canada, there were a number of reports that started to come out about contamination in the Arctic. And as you know, Canada has a large proportion of the size of the country that is in the Arctic region. When Norma was telling us this story, she remembers research that was done on breast milk, and they were finding organochlorines and other scary contaminants in breast milk. And that raised the questions about, that this was coming from food sources. And this was a very, very new finding at the time. So it was incredibly scary for people, especially because the source of this contamination was coming from faraway places and condensing and concentrating in the north. So you can imagine she said that, our food systems, if our food systems were contaminated and we can't use our food systems, what were we going to eat? So it was definitely a pressing issue that affected the whole northern part of Canada. And we're talking about, 75,000 Indigenous people in that area spread over a large region and from different diverse backgrounds. So it was quite a pressing issue at the time. And we can see there was some reporting on it nationally and even and locally as well. So this is a picture of Norma in 1995 approximately, and she's probably holding up some dried caribou. And the question at the time was, is our food safe to eat? And how was that going to be? How were these questions going to be answered? So at the time, leadership came together in the north. So there were a lot of meetings that were happening in Yellowknife, which is one of the main cities in the north in the Northwest Territories. And the leadership was coming together to figure out how to address the issue, because it wasn't being handled very well by the government officials and other agencies who were just not communicating the idea of risk very clearly. And Norma talks about how this idea of having a parts per billion contaminant in something that you're eating was very difficult, if not impossible, for community people to understand. So it sounds like a lot, right? Parts per billion, that must be a heck of a lot of contamination, but the fact that it was so small and it wasn't really a risk was quite confusing. So this leadership had come together from representing a broad range of Indigenous peoples in the North to decide to lobby government to put the demand that research had to be done in a way that would respect their needs and their concerns. So at the bottom picture here, at the picture on the left, you see some of the members of the CNA governing board that was formed out of this interest, out of this concern actually of people coming together, and they were actually the leadership who mobilized the resources and the expertise at McGill University with Harriet and other researchers, along with government officials, to put together a research program, and to even have on the other side, we have a picture of the building at McGill University that was renovated to house this research center with funds that were lobbied from this group, because the need was so important and that research had to be done in a way that was at arm's length from the government. So it was difficult to trust that governments would be doing research on traditional food systems. So this is how the early beginnings of the governance of CNA happened, and why it looks this way with a governing board of Indigenous representation at a university at McGill, at a university in Canada. And this is just to give you a list of the organizations that were on the governing board that represented the different Indigenous groups across the North. And at the bottom we have the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake, which is not in the North, which is the community I am from, and is the host community for the territory upon which the research center sits in near Montreal. So now I'm going to turn it over to Harriet, who will tell you the story of how the research activities rolled out.
Thank you, Trina. So I will tell you a bit about the timeline, and just to recap a few words. It was in the late 1980s where the research was showing that the contaminants were there, and the questions were asked, is the food safe to eat? Then in the early 90s, I mean, this is a long period of time that the development was taking place. But there were government programs developing to deal with contaminants, particularly the Arctic Environmental Strategy. But there was distrust by the communities, and the Indigenous leaders then went forward to call for independent research, as Trina was explaining. So finally, in 92 and 93, a grant application for several $1 million in different portions was submitted to government, and it was lobbied by the Indigenous leaders for the funding, and CNA became established in 1992. So then in 93, the building was renovated, as I mentioned, and at the same time as our research was being brought forward between 94 and 2000, the Arctic Environmental Strategy were presenting the data at international conventions that then called for the control and the stopping the production and emissions of PCBs and other organochlorines. We're really talking about a suite of organochlorine and heavy metal contaminants that were the focus of the Arctic Environmental Strategy. So that was that 10-year period when that research took place, and I'll give you some more of those results encapsulated. Beyond 2005, there were other Canadian Indigenous research programs coming out, and CNA was participating and leading the International Polar Year, helping with the Cree Board of Health, Trina's community at the Kahnawake School's Diabetes Prevention Program, and so forth. In 2001 and forward, there were also the development of international Indigenous research programs with CNA leadership through the United Nations, particularly the Food and Agriculture Organization. And so up to the present time, we now have continued McGill support for CNA for research and education. So these are this is a few pictures from Normas territory, the Vuntut-Gwich'in territory in Arctic Canada, and 2 pictures of caribou, raw and cooked, which are favorite winter meals. Caribou is the #1 traditional food by way of weight and consumption patterns for all of the indigenous communities across the north. So caribou is very important, and you heard Norma's presentation, some of you, hopefully most of you, Norma's presentation about the concern for preserving the Arctic Wildlife Refuge to protect those caribou. And then, so the First Nations and the Northwest Territories and the Yukon represented here with major traditional food resources being wildlife, animals, and fish. And for the Inuit, who live primarily, almost exclusively, except for one community actually, in sea-based communities, sea mammal foods are really very important there. And we took a special closer look at them. So the major activities, once the funding was guaranteed for McGill University, the first step was start the renovations to the building and to recruit additional staff that would give us more interdisciplinarity to deal with the complex situations that we were facing. So we had recruitment with the board's participation, active participation, and interviewing help for an epidemiologist and a toxicologist who complemented my expertise in nutrition and food composition, as well as Professor Tim Johns, who is an ethnobotanist. So the next step was to develop the community research agreements with the assistance of the governing board members. There were regional meetings and community meetings, and the community teams for the research were being set up with a great deal of participation from each of the communities that were involved. There was also the lab setup, which was expensive and detailed for the contaminant analysis, both the organochlorine and heavy metal methodologies, as well as the nutrient analysis. And Norma told us that she herself was responsible for collecting more than 400 samples of the traditional foods from the Yukon First Nations. But overall, there were more than 2,000 samples taken from the north and analyzed in the Sine laboratories. And of course, the interview and dietary analysis to understand just how much of these foods were being consumed. We also established a community education office with an outreach coordinator, and we had the university demands of professors, which are substantial, where everybody had to look after their publications and teaching both undergraduate and graduate students and making contributions by way of grant reviews and other meetings within the university, those contributions to the scientific process. So I'm going to give it back to Trina now.
So I just wanted to give you a little bit of information on that educational component that was one of the activities of CNA at the time. So you can imagine with the emphasis all of a sudden on the safety of traditional food systems, which have always been just, the way to have a healthy way of eating, and then also talking about foods that come from the market and talking about nutrition and nutrition benefits and contaminant risks, required there were actually some requests that we need to do some nutrition workshops. And because I have a background I'm a dietitian, we worked with the community health representatives who are the people on the ground who, address a lot of different health issues, to put together some really fun workshops where we were, going out on the land and setting rabbit snares because, you have to understand the food system if you're going to understand the nutrition about it. And because of residential school experiences, many of the women who were working as community health representatives had not had the experience of being on the land and felt not really in a position to talk about traditional foods because of their experiences. But we also did things like looking at what's available in the store and looking at how there's not much diversity if we're talking about spaghetti and spaghetti sauce. We have tomatoes, wheat, and a few things there. So we had these workshops to bring, some educational information to the community. And we talked about, of course, the expensive cost of food in the north because of the transportation costs and the storage costs. But it was important for us to provide information that was requested from the community about food systems and nutrition. And another aspect of the education program was to just share information about the way CNA did research. We did some work around promoting careers in nutrition so that if there was interest, that we would be able to, support people who wanted to follow that pathway. And talking about, again, this very difficult message of balancing nutritional benefits from the food with the reality that there was a small amount of contaminants in it. So these were some of the videos that were produced as part of the educational activities. So I'm going to pass it over again to Harriet. She'll talk about where this work was taking place.
Great, thank you. So, once the funding was in place, the first steps, as I mentioned before, were to get our full staff complement of research assistants and the community assistants. It was really important to get into the community straight away. So here you have a map of these early research projects in the north. There were the Yukon First Nations communities that you see in white spots, and the Dene Métis communities in red, and the Inuit communities that are presented there in yellow. So there was a total of 46 communities that were engaged in the research that represented somewhere between 70 and 75,000 northern Indigenous peoples. So we established the research agreements and then proceeded with the lab analysis and the interviews. But it was very important for everyone to recognize that the contaminants were a big concern, but we recognized straight away that you can't just look at the contaminants, because you're certainly going to find them at parts per billion, and it's going to be very scary. You have to look at the benefit side of this traditional food use as well. And so we proceeded to do that. But those communities were actively involved in the research, and we also had other things going on, as you can see in this map. At the same time, there are additional projects being requested from CNE in British Columbia, in the Mohawk community in Ganawage, in northern Ontario and northern Quebec, and as well in Mille Lacs and Lac-Courtois. We had a request to come there and look at the Indigenous people's food systems there and concerns for food quality. So in the 20 years since then, we have been training other professors, and they have spread out into other Canadian universities. And nearly all of the Indigenous communities in Canada, more than 700 of them, have had some involvement in CNE research projects since that time. Not only the research, and as you can see here, the research spots where that was done, but there were also the courses that Trina was explaining, as well as workshops that were returning results to the communities, as well as asking for their help in the interpretation of the results. So with the research agreements that were in place, it was a matter of developing a firm methodology to get the answers to these questions. Is the food safe to eat, and what are the benefits and risks? So the very first step was developing a food list of traditional food. As you can see in this diagram, which I think I have shown at this meeting, probably in the first meeting that we had here. Anyway, the idea was to look at the balance between traditional food and market food as it contributes to the total diet. So once we had the list of traditional foods from each community and region, then we were able to proceed with the sample collection. As I mentioned, there were more than 2,000 samples collected that were analyzed. And then with the dietary information, we were able to look at the balance between the traditional food and the market food. So this is one of the key results in the beginning. It shows the percent of energy, which is really the daily calories coming from traditional food in these communities. Each spot represents the results from one community, okay, that you see here in Yukon, Dene Métis, and Inuit communities. And the results show that there's really precious little traditional food being consumed, a low of 5% of the daily calories on an annual average, because there were seasonal dietary interviews being done. A low of about 5% in the Dene Métis, up to a high of about 40% in the remote Inuit communities. So the good news, of course, from all the nutrient analysis is that this traditional food is very good. But it's also good news, in a way, that very little of this food is being consumed, because the contaminants that are present there don't present the risk of exceeding the World Health Organization's guidelines for safe intakes of the suite of organochlorine and heavy metal contaminants. So some of the favorite Inuit foods, as I mentioned, are sea mammals, and here you have some pictures of the whale, muktuk or mattek, which is essentially the whale skin and blubber. And we were taking a close look at this because sea mammals are high up on the food chain within the food system of the Arctic people, and especially the Inuit. But along the way, we found this good news of the unexpected sources of excellent levels of micronutrients. That whale skin on a per weight basis has the amount of vitamin C that's equivalent to a glass of orange juice. Weight per weight, 100 grams of whale skin and orange juice gives about 30 to 35 milligrams of vitamin C. Seal liver, goose lung, dried whale meat, exceedingly rich source of iron, and vitamin A and vitamin D as well. So this was something that we could actually present back to the communities to encourage them not to leave these foods off the table. And carrying that another step by looking at those thousands of dietary interviews on a statistical basis for all of the three regions, the Yukon, the Dene Métis, and the Inuit, on a statistical basis, the nutrients were significantly higher on those recalls days that had even one small portion of traditional food. So from protein through the vitamins and minerals that you see here. And it was only on days without any traditional food at all that it was significantly more fat, saturated fat, sucrose, and sodium. All those things we're trying to reduce in our diets. And as well, because of the anomaly of food fortifications for vitamin C and folate in crystal drinks in the Inuit territory during that period, there was also more vitamin C and folate in the Inuit communities. So as time went by, the methods and results were published and presented at scientific meetings, and the widespread information reached the United Nations, and the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization both requested participation from SINE to develop an international program for the study of Indigenous peoples' food systems. And I won't go into these results. There are two large publications that you see here and the websites where they're available free online. But the message is the same. The traditional food is the best food they have, not the food, the industrial food, the food that does not give the good health benefits. The UN also has developed the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and a special Indigenous Peoples section of the FAO which continues to gather data from international communities of Indigenous peoples. And there are two documents, two guidelines from SINE, shown here, one which is a methodology for guiding developing participatory research with communities, and the other is the methodology for developing the research to understand the traditional and market food consumption. So with that, I'm gonna do this part, right? Okay, so what were some of the challenges? And as you can appreciate, in the early days, politics was a big deal. The government and the Indigenous peoples had some pretty fierce politics over this issue, and the university was always caught in the middle. The government wanted this, they say, we don't give you money unless you do that, and the Indigenous people say, you have to stand up for us. Money is always a problem. There was a lot of travel to the north. There was competition for limited resources from other research centers. We had sustainable funding, but we wanted to have it continuing beyond 5 years. We had changing funder priorities. Time is a big issue when you have research demands and other university demands for the professoriate and their staff, as well as the time that's needed for coordinating meetings amongst busy people and the discussions, even for conference calls. So, what makes it work? We have the demand from the Indigenous leaders to government that something gets done about serious issues, so that pressure was there. There was always good relationship amongst the SINE board members. SINE responds to communities and had that reputation for doing research that is interdisciplinary and participatory and had value for the food that the people consumed. We also reported back to communities on a regular basis. There was mutual respect and trust on all the sides of the participants from SINE and the communities. Sharing methods and results, and it was important that the university continues to recognize SINE in the management, in their management, and speaks for the board to the university level. Here we go.
Okay. So I just have a few points to make about when we're talking about academic community partnerships. I'm actually very fortunate because I was trained in two distinct partnership projects, one with SINE, started when I was a graduate student. Harriet was my supervisor for my master's, and my work was in northern Quebec, but also in my own community of Ganawage, we had a diabetes prevention project that was set up as an academic community partner. And I was usually the community, I was a student trainee for SINE side, but I was a community advisory board member for the Ganawage project. And so I was often asked to talk about the community perspective of these partnerships. And just with this presentation, realized that I never had the chance to really talk about the research perspective. So I just wanted to mention that it's important to do good science and good research in these partnerships. So it's a balance of doing that as well. And researchers within the institution, within universities, are working within systems that don't make this kind of work really easy. So it requires a lot of navigation, negotiation, and to be able to do research successfully is not easy, but SINE researchers have been able to do that, evidenced by the number of publications they've had, by the type of research that includes many disciplines to address these complex issues, by having consistently externally funded projects which require a track record. And I think one of the most important things is being invited to communities and being welcomed back to communities. This is especially important now. In Canada, we're in an era of reconciliation where we had a truth and reconciliation process to tell the story, the truth about what's happened through residential school systems in Canada as an expression of a very oppressive relationship that Canada has with Indigenous peoples. And now we have these calls to actions which are requiring all sectors of Canadian society to do things differently so we build mutually respectful relationships with Indigenous people. And SINE is actually within an institution that is a model for how to do this. So I think that's a really important indicator of the success of this kind of work. In terms of researchers in university, they have to teach and train students, and CNA's demonstrated that they do this very well. We have a picture there of my student who was up in a community this summer, and she's working with youth planting dune grass, which had nothing to do with her research, but everything to do with learning about youth and being present and useful in the community, because that's what makes a difference when you do have a research question that you want to ensure that it's going to be useful for the community. And I think one of the most enriching experiences I've had so far since I've returned to McGill is to sit down with trainees and to talk about the importance of first acknowledging that Indigenous communities have self-determination in their research, and their research projects are not the priority. That's important, but they must prioritize the Indigenous community self-determination for research. So that whole process of having students reflect on their role has been very enriching. And of course, over the 20 years, you can imagine people have come and go from CNA, and there's now this diaspora of CNA scholars across Canada, which is fun because I have colleagues in many places and we all collaborate with each other. And professors are also, giving their service to the academic process. The final point I want to make is about research ethics. And you can't do any research, collect any data, academic research, that is, if you don't have approval from an institutional review board. So this is a committee that will review a research protocol and assess to see if it's ethical. And you don't get your research funds released if you don't have ethical approval, and you can't collect any data. And it sounds very negative, but this is sometimes how it feels when you have to get these approvals to start your research. But this process has complexified incredibly over the past 20 years, and for good reason. It's because communities have rights to create knowledge the way they want to create knowledge, and that has to be respected by academic research. So what we've seen is just an incredible increase in the number of guidelines that need to be negotiated for research. And institutional review boards also are navigating that because there are many, many levels, and we've been able to navigate this successfully. So another indicator of our success there. And so as a final message, I wanted to say that I think that CNA has set a strong foundation for collaborative research to address these questions about the integrity of food systems. And this is not over. There's a very pressing current and concerns about climate change, and these are going to go into the future as well. And the importance of understanding the implications of climate change on food systems is really what we're concerned with right now. So we're very hopeful that we can continue to do good research in this way. Thank you very much for your attention.